How fitting is it that despite a year of chaos taking over the college football world, the national title game ends with two very familiar faces. Alabama, this is going to be their sixth appearance in the national title game in 8 years of the playoff existing, which is just, to me, absolutely frightening, terrifying, whatever you want to call it. I mean, 6 out of 8 is just crazy. And then Georgia making their second. Kirby Smart has made one before. He's only been to the playoff twice, and in both of those trips to the playoff, he has reached the national title game. The interesting note here is, as many of us know, Kirby Smart was a former Nick Saban assistant. He is 0-4 against Saban in that time span as a coach at Georgia as well. So Smart here has an opportunity to throw himself out there to make his name even more known and to show that his program is elite, that it's not just in that tier 1.5, lower tier 1 area, but that it can be the best team in the country. It would be Georgia's first national title since 1980 if they win. Alabama, well, it's like every other year for Nick Saban and his program. They would be back-to-back national champions as they won the national title last year. Today, I am going to preview this game and at the end, give my prediction. I'm also going to talk about key players from both sides as well and give my thoughts all throughout the video. If you're new to this channel, especially if you're an SEC fan, because I don't really target you all a lot, hit that like button and hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. I cannot stress enough how much it pleases me to see the comment sections full. Even though it makes it harder for me to reply to each comment, and I try to reply to as many as I can, I like seeing people put their thoughts down below, promote discussion, and help grow the community by commenting, subscribing, and liking. So please do all those things, and now let's get to the actual game. First and foremost, I want to preview some of just the basics here. Georgia is given a 58.4% chance to win according to ESPN's Football Power Index, and they are also favored by 2.5 points according to ESPN's Pick Center. The spread has been about in between 2.5 to 3. It's been flipping back and forth between those numbers ever since the odds were released late New Year's Eve, early New Year's Day after the conclusion of the playoff games. Georgia is 9-5 against the spread. Alabama is 8-6. Georgia's one loss was to Alabama in the SEC championship game, and Georgia's sole loss was to an 8-4 A&M team. Georgia is once again picked to win over Bama by both Vegas and the computers. And from my understanding, a good portion of the population is also picking Georgia to win after seeing their very impressive beatdown of my Michigan Wolverines. And, I mean, I get why there is confidence here, and I'm not going to talk about my prediction just yet, but Saban has a knack for beating former assistants, and it does shock me how a lot of people are still on the Georgia train after witnessing that SEC championship game defeat. But to their defense, and a point that I'm going to make is, it's very hard to beat a good team twice, especially when one side of the ball for that team has a historic level to it, and I'm talking about Georgia's defense. And speaking of Georgia's defense, let's get right into what I think will be the critical matchup, which is Georgia's defense versus Alabama's offense. The last time these two met, the quote-unquote number one defense looked like some of the Michigan defenses under Don Brown when they were proclaimed number one and faced an actual offense. They gave up, I believe, 41 points to Alabama while only scoring 24 of their own. Giving up 41 is a lot. That is by far the most they have given up all year. Georgia's defense, nonetheless, I mean, including that 41, they only allow 9.5 points per game. 253.9 total yards. 172 of those are passing yards. Only 81 are rushing yards. Ladies and gentlemen, those right there are near video game stats. This defense is good. It's full of 5 stars. They're developed. Dan Lanning and Glenn Schumann have done an amazing job this year with the defense. It also ranks first in efficiency, according to ESPN. Some stars on this defense, as you definitely know, don't get why that took so long, Naboke Dean being the main one. He leads the team in tackles with 68. He has 6 sacks, 5 passes defended, 2 picks, 1 returned for 6, and 2 forced fumbles. You also, outside of him, you got Nolan Smith, another linebacker, 48 total tackles, 2.5 sacks, a pass defended, and 3 forced fumbles and a fumble recovery. Jordan Davis as well, a defensive lineman, very well known, 2 sacks and 30 total tackles. This Georgia defense is crazy. Their front 7 is the best for sure. Part of the reason they did not match up the best with Alabama is because Alabama chooses to attack your secondary more so than your front 7, and Georgia's secondary is their kryptonite. It's also why Georgia did so well against a team like Michigan. Michigan tries to bully front 7s, whereas you could say Alabama tries to out-sprint or hop over your secondary. And that was a really good matchup for Georgia, the Michigan game, one that they certainly exploited. Georgia's defense is well coached. They have lots of talent. They'll pounce on you whenever. Georgia's leader in interceptions is Darion Kendrick, a defensive back. He has 38 total tackles, 3 passes defended, and 4 interceptions. Some other leaders on this team in total tackles include Lewis Kine, a defensive back, Channing Tindall, a linebacker, who has 59 total tackles and 4.5 sacks. Again, like I said, Georgia's linebacker core is the best in the country. They don't necessarily have the best player. I'd say that's Will Anderson in the linebacker department, but Naboke Dean is pretty close, and combining him with Adden Anderson, Robert Beal Jr., Channing Tindall, and Nolan Smith, it cannot get better than that overall. Georgia's defense has 45 total sacks, 14 interceptions, and 10 forced fumbles. It's a defense that is very hard to push. It's very hard to break. But Alabama's offense, moving over to another critical piece in this game, has done exactly what I've mentioned. This offense has sputtered at times, and its defense, despite being not the most efficient, but good nonetheless, sometimes the defense has had to save Alabama's offense in some lesser games. The LSU game could be a prime example in that regard, and the Florida game, where Alabama's defense came up clutch and prevented a 2-point conversion that would have tied the game and swung all the momentum in favor of Florida earlier in the year. This Alabama offense, though, has a Heisman QB at quarterback in Bryce Young. They score 41.1 points per game. They force, on average, nearly 500 yards on their opponents. 336 of those are passing yards. They love to air it out. And Bill O'Brien, from what Alabama fans tell me, and from what I hear and have seen, loves to use the shotgun and just loves to throw it and then loves to run it. Doesn't necessarily like to use a lot of play action. His play calling has sometimes frustrated Alabama fans, but nonetheless, 336 passing yards a game, 158 rushing a game are not really numbers to complain about. The offense is third in efficiency. It is actually behind Georgia's in efficiency, but it outdoes Georgia and many other offenses when it comes to points per game and total yards. Alabama's offense, of course, is led by Bryce Young at quarterback with 4,503 passing yards, completes 67.6% of his passes, averages 9.2 yards per pass, 46 passing touchdowns, only 5 interceptions. He's been sacked 35 times. Alabama's O-line this year has been nothing to boast about, but nonetheless, despite the struggles at O-line And despite this being the first year that he has started, he has a 173.7 passer rating, which is nothing like Mac Jones. It's not like Tua Tagovailoa's or Joe Burrow's. This year's been kind of a down year in college football when it comes to quarterbacks. He's still solidified himself as the best. He doesn't have the same Alabama supporting cast as past teams do. He's a special kid, and next year, he's just only going to get better, and already I would say that he is prepared to play and start in the NFL, as a lot of Nick Saban quarterbacks have been in recent years. Alabama's led on the ground by Brian Robinson Jr. and Trey Sanders specifically. Robinson with 1,275 rushing yards, 5.1 yards per carry, and 14 rushing touchdowns. His backup, Trey Sanders, has 309 rushing yards, 4.4 yards per carry, and 2 rushing touchdowns. Names like Roydell Williams and Jace McClellan, who are 2 other running backs as well, may also pop up. Bryce Young doesn't normally scramble, but he can make plays if he is forced out of the pocket. He only has 43 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. He only averages just over a half yard per carry. But speaking of the matchup between Georgia, the last time he faced Georgia, he rushed for 40 yards, and I don't think he got sacked once. So Alabama's O-line has been stepping up in play, especially in the past 2 games. On the receiving end for Alabama, you have Jameson Williams, their primary wide receiver. He does not get the most targets. That's John Mechie with 96. But Mechie is unfortunately injured. I pray that he recovers nicely, and I'm going to assume that he's going to go to the draft just because. So hopefully he does well at the combine and whatever. But we're not really going to be talking about him or bringing up his stats because they're not going to be impacting the game, which will impact Jameson Williams in that wide receiver core, as Williams and Mechie were they were the duo to be reckoned with, and Williams had to be used differently in the later half of the SEC championship game, and he had to be used differently in the playoff game against Cincinnati. So that could be a factor as well that could play in favor of Georgia's defense. Williams with 1,507 receiving yards, 20.1 average yards per reception. That's a big number. That's crazy. I mean, he's their legit deep threat. And a reminder to all of you out there, he is only at Alabama because of how deep Ohio State's wide receiver room is. Williams has 15 receiving touchdowns on the year. Also watch out for names like Slade Bolden and Trayshawn Holden and Ja'Cory Brooks. Those are 3 wide receivers that I expect one of them to step up in place and assist in, helping out and plugging in the hole that Mechie left due to injury. Cameron Latu, the tight end, and Brian Robinson Jr., the running back, also are players that have over 250 receiving yards, and both have at least 2 touchdowns. Cameron Latu with 7, and Robinson Jr. with 2. So watch out for those guys. That's Alabama's offense, and we already previewed Georgia's defense. This is the matchup that will determine the winner, because if the exact same thing happened last time in the SEC championship game, if this is a repeat for Georgia's defense of the SEC championship game, Georgia will lose, because we have seen what Stetson Bennett has done against Alabama the last 2 times it was a shootout. And that's not to say that Stetson Bennett is incapable of beating Alabama, but the defense, you can't allow 41 points and expect to still be favored to win the game. So Georgia's defense is going to have to do more than they did in the SEC championship game. That is for sure. But not to worry, Georgia's offense, despite what seemed to be maybe me insulting them a few seconds ago, Stetson Bennett has made plays. He did very well against Michigan, who is a proven defense. And Georgia's offense scores nearly the same amount of points per game that Alabama's offense does. And they're second in the nation in efficiency. This Georgia offense is, it actually reminds me a lot like Michigan's offense to a certain degree. You're not always trying to air it out. There's a lot of running involved. But unlike Michigan, Georgia's offense is really, they're very effective at the intermediate to long pass. Whereas Michigan, you're not necessarily always doing that. You don't have the quarterback talent or the wide receiver talent to always target those areas. And to be honest with you, Todd Monken is probably one of the best OCs in the land as well. And combining that with 5-star talent, that really helps. So Georgia's potent offense is led by Stetson Bennett at quarterback, who has thrown for 2,638 yards, completes 64.4% of his passes, averages 10.1 yards per pass. He's thrown 27 touchdowns, 7 picks. He's only been sacked 9 times. The Georgia O-line has been one of the more solid O-lines this year. It is one of the best in the country. And Bennett has a 178 passer rating. You hear that? That is higher. That is higher than Bryce Young's by about 5 points, which is insane. Bennett leads an offense that scores 39 points per game, forces 448 yards of offense on its opponents on average, has 253.9 passing yards, 194.6 rushing yards. Georgia, as I already said, loves to run the football. And they have quite the running back group. You have Zamir White, James Cook, Kenny McIntosh, and Stetson Bennett can also run the football as well. Kendall Milton is another name to look out for. You look at Georgia and their run game, they have 6 guys who have over 200 rushing yards, which is crazy. Zamir White is the main running back. He leads the team in rushing attempts with 147. He has 772 rushing yards for 5.3 yards per carry and 10 rushing touchdowns. James Cook, brother of Dalvin Cook, is second on the team in rushing yards with 651. He averages 6.1 yards per carry, and he has 7 rushing touchdowns. McIntosh has 3 rushing touchdowns, along with Dejon Edwards. Kendall Milton has 1, and Stetson Bennett, the quarterback, has 1 as well. And Bennett does have legs. He has 283 rushing yards on the year for about 5.9 yards per rush. So Bennett can hurt you with his legs, and I think it will be something that'll add to this game is Bennett, you really didn't see his legs in action, nor his decision-making in the SEC championship game. I'm curious to see how they will be different or if they will be similar. If Bennett can play a game like he did against Michigan, Georgia doesn't have to have, they don't have to have their best or perfect defensive game to win if Bennett avoids key mistakes and if he uses his legs. Because even though he was not that good last year, he has certainly stepped up his play this year. Even in situations where he is forced to pass the ball, he has improved compared to last year. And the run game, as I've already mentioned, and as you very well know if you've been paying attention to college football, is one of the more solid rushing games in the nation with almost 3,000 rushing yards. On the receiving end of things, Georgia is led by tight end Brock Bowers in receptions with 52 and receiving yards with 846. Bowers is one of the best offensive players in the nation. He averages 16.3 yards per reception. He has 12 receiving touchdowns. Jermaine Burton and Ladd McConkey are both wide receivers with around 450 receiving yards, and both have 5 receiving touchdowns. Adonai Mitchell as well is another wide receiver to watch out for. He has 3 receiving touchdowns and 376 receiving yards. James Cook, who saw a lot of action in the game against Michigan, has 269 receiving yards and 4 receiving touchdowns. McIntosh, another running back, Kyrus Jackson, Darnell Washington, Arian Smith are other names to watch out for as well. George Pickens has seen action. Not a lot of it. He only has 4 receptions for 55 yards. People keep saying that he could be a playmaker and jump out. I really haven't seen it, but I don't think they need him to beat Alabama either. I mean, you have plenty of key receivers, notably Brock Bowers, who is a tight end. You have plenty of those guys who can make plays, do all sorts of things that you need to win a game. So Georgia, your offense is very good, and we'll see how it compares and competes with the Alabama defense. Alabama's defense allows 20.2 points per game. It's certainly not the best unit in the land. It allows 306 yards, 223 of those are passing, 82 of those are rushing. Georgia and Alabama both having very elite rushing defenses and both having very elite linebacker cores. Alabama's defense is led by, of course you would guess it, Will Anderson Jr., the linebacker. He has 17 and a half sacks on the year, 97 total tackles, and 2 passes defended. Fidarian Mathis, a defensive lineman, has 9 sacks. He's second in sacks and 2 passes defended, a forced fumble, and 2 fumble recoveries. Dallas Turner, Henry To'o, another linebacker, they combine for 10 and a half sacks, 2 passes defended, a forced fumble, and a fumble recovery. This defense here has some weaknesses in the secondary. It has youth all around, but they seem, to me at least, they seem to be improving as everything progresses. You know, they held Auburn to 22 points, and that was including overtime. They held Georgia to 24. They held Cincinnati to 6. They've been slowly getting better as the year goes on. And it's kind of the same with their offense. Alabama is a team, I thought Michigan was peaking at the right time. Alabama is truly a team that to me is peaking at the right time. They have 3 defensive backs with 3 interceptions. DeMarco Helms, Jalen Armour Davis, and Jordan Battle. Battle has 2 pick sixes out of the 3 interceptions, and all 3 of those defensive backs have 3 passes defended. Alabama's defense has 52 sacks on the year, 15 interceptions, and 4 forced fumbles. I'm interested in this matchup as well. I think the previous one has some more variability to it, as we've seen, notably in the Orange Bowl, how deadly Georgia's offense can be. We've seen it all year even, but recency bias affected some of us. I admit that I was somewhat plagued by it, even though I had reasons for Michigan to win. And Alabama's defense certainly has some weaknesses to it, but I feel with how Alabama's defense is designed, they attack the run a lot, and that's Georgia's strength in a certain sense. That's the reason Bennett has such a good rating and has had a lot of good plays. He isn't necessarily forced to pass the ball a lot, and that's what Alabama did to him. And Alabama has a great matchup against Georgia's offense when it comes to how Georgia's offense normally operates in, the run game. And Alabama's offense has that mismatch with Georgia's secondary. So I feel like Georgia's offense versus Alabama's defense is kind of a sort of known outcome. I'd expect around the middle ground between these 2 units. Georgia scored 24 points. I'd expect something similar in the national title game against Alabama's defense. So that's previewing Georgia's offense and Alabama's defense here. Both of these teams, again, star talent, 5-star talent to be specific, is sprinkled throughout every position. It's fascinating. These 2 teams are truly the best they're truly the best in the nation. So, another factor that I wanted to talk about. Normally I discuss the breakout players from what I think is the most critical matchup. I'm doing something a little different. We are going to talk about, just for like a minute or 2, it's going to be a shorter section for sure, the Bryce Young factor. Bryce Young on the year has had a 173.7 passer rating, completes 67.6% of his passes. He's eclipsed 4,500 passing yards, 46 touchdown passes. And in games against ranked opponents, he's passed for 3 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns against Miami, 3 against Florida, 2 against Ole Miss, 5 against Arkansas. I mean, he shows up truly when it matters. He's a leader. He does what needs to be done. He rarely makes mistakes. He's only had 5 interceptions thrown, 1 against Auburn, another against Cincinnati, and those 2 have, pretty solid defenses. His play, I would say, throughout the year, much like Alabama, it has gotten better, where earlier in the year you saw some offensive inconsistencies and mental errors. By the end of the year, especially with his performance against Georgia in the SEC championship game, he was truly the Heisman winner. So the question here, the Bryce Young factor, is how well will Georgia be able to slow him down? You're not going to be able to contain him per se. I think that he will have, he will pass for touchdowns. He will have a scramble or 2 that makes you want to throw your headset if you were Kirby Smart on the sideline. The question is, how well can they contain him, specifically on 3rd down? I saw a statistic somewhere, and I don't know necessarily how true it is, so take it for what it's worth, but I saw somewhere that when Georgia on 3rd down rushed 4 guys, Bryce Young converted all those 3rd downs. When they blitzed and sent multiple pressure, overwhelming Alabama's, let's face it, inferior O-line, it helped them stop Bryce Young. So I'll be curious to see what Dan Lanning comes up with in an attempt to stop Bryce Young, and it'll be interesting to see. It'll actually be fascinating to see if it works or not, because Young, again, that Georgia game, he's facing undisputedly the best defensive line in the nation, and he rushed for a career 2nd place rushing yards. He rushed for 42 against Tennessee. He ran for 40 against Georgia, and he's never rushed for more than 42 on the year. And he ran for 40 yards and a touchdown, only 3 attempts with an average of 13.3 yards per rush. So it's interesting, and I think Bryce Young and how he plays and how he's contained, again, to relate back to Alabama's offense, matching up against Georgia's defense, certainly determines the game, as he is the X factor for this team, along with Jamison Williams, which brings me to the position-by-position rankings. Alabama here, there are certainly mismatches with the rest of this Georgia team. Looking at how, Georgia's O-line is just really good. They haven't allowed nearly the amount of sacks. Georgia's run game is certainly superior as well. You have Brock Bowers at tight end. Their D-line and linebacker core, we already know how good they are. Both of the secondaries for these units have their weaknesses, and I'd say are the weaknesses of their defense, but Georgia's is certainly better, and Alabama's special teams has certainly had its issues all year. So Alabama's key connection to winning this game is their quarterback and wide receivers, honestly. Bryce Young, Jamison Williams, how well do they perform? How much of a load do they take on? Or are there any guys for Alabama that step up and fill in the void that John Mechie left because of his injury? And for the rest of the Georgia team, even though you are actually favored in talent and experience, it's not enough. And the most important position on the field, the quarterback position, we know from how these two met up which team has the better, the advantage at the best position on the field. So it also brings a question up that if Alabama's offense is rolling, if Georgia's defense can't hold them to 4 touchdowns, if Georgia's game plan just falls out of control, which it did against Alabama in the championship game, can Stetson Bennett step up, have a performance like he did in the Michigan game, throw good deep balls, not throw picks, throw it out of bounds instead of forcing it in the middle of the field? Can he use his legs to help Georgia in a game where their defense might be confused and abused by Alabama's offense? So that is the position-by-position matchup that I have presented to you all. It's my opinion. And again, if you disagree with that opinion or anything else in this video, comment on it down below. I love to have discussion, and I think that it is an important part of every college football channel to encourage discussion between fans. And finally, we are going to look at my prediction. And if you're a Georgia fan or you're an Alabama fan, Georgia fans, I'm sorry, but I have to go. I have to go with the GOAT. I have to. I think that I looked at this game after the Orange Bowl loss immediately and how Alabama performed. You performed better against Michigan than Alabama did against Cincy. You definitely won the most important, you won the most impressive semifinal performance. I think your win over Michigan was more important for momentum heading into this game than Alabama's was against Cincinnati. But I look at how Georgia's favored, at how people have seemingly, some, not all, have forgotten the SEC championship game. I look at the remaining mismatch there, and I look at Nick Saban's record. I doubted him once earlier this year by saying that Georgia was going to win by about 7 in the SEC championship game. I can't do it again. Despite Georgia, having a pretty significant advantage on most positions, the most critical ones and the most important positions, the wide receiver and the quarterback in the modern era of football, are Alabama's. And despite Georgia having the better O-line, Alabama's O-line has stepped up in its play the past 2 games. And if their play continues to be like that, where they were able to neuter Alabama's, front 7, neuter Cincy's front 7, it will be, honestly, giving Bryce Young time in the pocket is your worst nightmare. And Alabama has found a way to do that despite having very poor O-line play all these years. In the most important moment, Saban has come through. He's done this his entire career. So that's my explanation. I think it'll be a much closer game. They're not going to overlook Alabama. I think they overlooked them in the SEC championship game a little bit. They're not going to here. It'll be more of a back and forth affair. It won't be so one-sided for half of the game. It'll be entertaining. And if Georgia wins this one, it would not surprise me that much if they won. But I just have to go with the Tide. And that's really all I have to say for this video. Again, if you haven't already, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, click that notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this game and your prediction down below. I have the Tide. Who do you have, and by how many? Tell me below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around.